Well, thank you very much and good evening. As Sharon said, let me spend a couple minutes talking about the economic factors that were part of the Great Depression so that we have some context in which to understand the stories that you're going to hear tonight. And then after a few minutes, I want to tell my own stories about the Great Depression. In 1929, the unemployment rate was 3.2%. On March 4th, 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated, it was over 25%. In cities like Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, the unemployment was over 50%. In 1929, General Motors had 260,000 employees working in their plants. 15 months later, 150,000 of them were out of work. In May of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt got a letter from a man in Detroit, and he said, "I got out of jail in January, and I've been looking for a job for the last 5 months, and I can't get one." He said, "I'd like you to do something. Please write me a letter and put me back in prison so at least I have a bed and 3 meals a day." In September of 1929, the stock market was at 386, booming along. In June of 1932, it was at 41. It had lost 85% of its value. In the summer of 1933, the Soviet Union put ads in a number of newspapers around the country inviting 6,000 people to move to the Soviet Union where they would have a house and have a job. And we estimate that over 120,000 Americans applied to do that. It was a tough time. The other interesting thing in terms of employment was that 30% of the people that had jobs during this era, 1929 through 35 and all, they were working part-time. And then one last story that's local is that in October of 1936, Spencer Penrose, the owner and builder of the Broadmoor Hotel, closed the hotel until the following May because there wasn't enough business. And the real spin-off of that is that there were several hundred people who washed dishes, waited on tables, made the beds, did the laundry, swept the walks. They lost their jobs. Again, an interesting aspect of the local history here. So that hopefully gives you some context about the stories that you'll hear tonight. And I don't have one story, I just have a few short ones that I want to share with you. I was born here in Colorado Springs in May of 1935 at Glockner Hospital. And the first house I remember, I lived on Cedar Street on the east side of town. And then very quickly, we moved. We moved up with my grandparents who lived in the 2400 block of North Nevada. And the house they had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, living room, dining room, and a kitchen. And there were 8 of us living there. My grandfather, grandmother, my mother and father, myself, my baby brother, and my Aunt Frances and a friend of hers who didn't have a place to live. So we have 8 of us living in this house, and the only person who has a job is my father. And he worked for Alexander Film Company. And some of the things I remember as a child there was each morning when I got up in the kitchen, my grandmother would be working there and she'd be baking pies. And about 10 o'clock, my grandfather would come and get me, and we'd take the pies, put them in the back of the car, and drive over to Alexander's and deliver them to the commissary, and they were there for lunch. And so each day, my grandmother would make maybe $2 from making pies. One other remembrance I have from that is that there was a period when we were in the evenings when we were in the living room. There were 2 boxes. One box had fish hooks in it, and the other had these little small envelopes about an inch square. And as we were talking and listening to music, the adults were putting these fish hooks into these little envelopes and sealing them and putting them in another box. And later on, I asked my father, I said, were you making money that? He said, oh yeah, we got paid half a cent for each one. I thought, boy, you have to do 200 of those to make $1. But it was worthwhile for them. And one other experience I had, sometime there in the late 30s, there was a terrific infestation of jackrabbits on the plains here. And the county was very worried. It was bad for the farmers, it was bad for the ranchers. Jackrabbits were coming into the homes. And so I remember that, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, we would go over to the east side of town, east being about 1 block beyond Hancock. And they'd line the cars up. Maybe we have 8 to 10 cars. The women would be driving them. The men, and my father, would be sitting on the hood with a shotgun. And myself and the children, we'd be in back of the cars with the trunk open. And so they were driving very slowly, 1 to 2 miles an hour. And there were jackrabbits all over. And we in the back, we were running around picking up jackrabbits and throwing them in the trunk of the car. Well, when it was filled up, then we left and came to this office that the county ran, and they gave us a nickel for every jackrabbit we turned in. So if you had 40 jackrabbits, you made $2. And may not seem like a lot, but at that time, gasoline was 20 cents a gallon. So if my father got $2, he could put 10 gallons of gas in his car. Those are my personal stories here. My other experience with the Great Depression comes about from the past 10 years because during that time I've been portraying Franklin Roosevelt, and I've done it about 260 times and had a chance to travel around the country and heard a lot of interesting stories in the process. I remember being at the High Plains Chautauqua program in Greeley, and I was invited there to portray FDR, and the moderator introduced me, and I came out, and it was an afternoon program, and there were quite a few people from nursing homes that had come. So I came, and before I ever said a word, this woman stood up and said, "Thank you for saving our farm." That sort of started, and then somebody else stood up and said, "Thanks for giving a job in the WPA." And later on, when I thought about it, I thought, here are people that still remember programs that came out of the New Deal that saved their farm or gave this woman's father a job in the WPA and allowed them to survive in a very difficult time. In 2008, I had a chance, at the invitation of the New Mexico Historical Society, to spend 2 weeks traveling through New Mexico and each night going to a different town and talking about the New Deal because it was the 75th anniversary of the New Deal. One night I was in Gallup, New Mexico, and gave my talk, and afterwards people stood around, were telling stories, and this woman said she had been born on a small ranch near Gallup, and in 1930. Her grandfather lived with them, and in 1936 he died. And she said afterwards they found a paper which had a map of their ranch and explained to go a certain distance out back. So they went there and dug a hole, and they pulled a milk can out of the ground, and it had $200 in it. Well, he had earlier put his money in a bank, and the bank failed. And at that time, if you had been putting your money in a savings account there and it failed, that's it, no more money. He hated banks. And she said, remember him saying that he would never put money in a bank again. But I think it was an interesting story, in part because it's probably enough money to support that family at that time for a couple of months. And also it was reflective of thousands and thousands of people who put their money under a mattress, up in the attic, or hid it someplace where no one would find it, but would not put it in a bank. And they may have heard something that Jefferson once said, that we have more to fear from a banking establishment than we do from a standing army. I was invited also to speak as FDR to the New Mexico Historical Society convention in Albuquerque. And after I'd finished my talk, I was asked to present 2 certificates to 2 men were there who had been in the Civilian Conservation Corps. And these men were obviously, seemed to me about 90 years old. And so they came up and I gave them the certificate, and they couldn't have been more gracious and thanked me. They thought I was FDR, really. Thanked me for starting the FDR, starting the Civilian Conservation Corps, and said it was part of the best years of their lives, and the friendships they made and their sense of accomplishment in doing something at a difficult time. And they were 2 of the several million young men who were in the Civilian Conservation Corps. And when they joined, they got a place to live, clothing, food, medical care, and they were paid $1 a day. And of that $1, 75 cents went back to the families of each of these young men. And they were proud that they were doing 2 things, helping their country and also helping support their family, that they weren't on the dole. The government was giving them money, but they were giving them money to do something. And I think that was one of the important aspects of the New Deal and how FDR approached it. And I really got a wonderful feeling being with those 2 men who had been part of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the work that they've done is still with us today. So, those are my stories. Thank you.